Good afternoon. Welcome to A Proven Approach to Interactive Signage Delivery, a webinar hosted by Intuilab and Digital Signage Today. My name is Bradley Cooper. I'm the editor of Digital Signage Today, and I'll be moderating today's discussion with Geoff Bessin of Intuilab. The interactive project market is currently $500 million in size, and digital signage operators are increasingly integrating interactive elements. But it can be a major challenge handling the business aspect. Does your team have the right skill set? How do you analyze service quotations and RFPSs? How can you maximize both margins and customer satisfaction? Today, Geoff will be talking about how you can build a profitable and scalable interactive signage delivery business. Please submit any questions during the presentation, which will be answered in a Q&A following the presentation. With that, I'm passing the mic off to Geoff.
Bradley, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. It's said that there are over 600 companies serving the traditional digital signage market, providing the infrastructure for delivering traditional, non-interactive signage to companies around the world. It is a very well-served marketplace, not to mention all of the agencies doing bespoke development as well. There is a large untapped opportunity for interactive digital signage. We estimate, based on reports, that there's over a $500 million interactive services opportunity waiting for agencies to grab it. The problem is it's a bit of a foreign marketplace for a lot of these agencies and integrators considering a movement into that space. There are some things about that space that are unique. I work for Intuilab, a company that provides software enabling companies and agencies and integrators to create interactive content without writing code. Our product has been shipping since early 2012, and in the early days, its main consumer were companies going to trade shows or building sales pitches. But over time, as the traditional signage marketplace commoditized, we started gaining a following of agencies and integrators who wanted to build interactive content for their clients. Today, amongst over 1,600 customers, I'd say 1/3 to 1/2 are agencies and integrators using our software to build interactive content for their clients. We have a lot of experience working with these agencies and integrators, and we've gained some insight about how to run a profitable and scalable business, which is what I'd like to share with you today. So this is based on the insight we've gathered over quite a few years, learning along with our own customers about what works, what doesn't work, and what you need to consider to be successful. There's a difference between the opportunity and being able to properly, aggressively, and scalably capture that opportunity, and hopefully I can help clarify some of that for you. Let's first define interactivity. This might seem a bit foolish, but in fact there's lots of different ways to slice and dice interactivity, and if you're going to target this opportunity either as an agency or an integrator, you need to understand the big picture. Now, of course, the typical understanding of interactivity is touch. That normally would be fingers on a screen, right? It's typically it. The screen could be wall-mounted, could be table-mounted, could be a tablet, could be a phone. There's lots of different modalities used in any possible context. It could be a sales pitch, a museum exhibition, an information kiosk, you name it, right? This is traditional and frankly so ubiquitous that these days even, our 3-year-old children are tapping screens. It's just natural. And at this point, sort of beyond demographics to some extent. We no longer have to worry about whether or not a particular member of the audience would be comfortable using a touch screen. We're past that point where we have to worry about the age or the exposure of a particular audience. So this is the traditional notion of interactivity that we've come to expect. Hardware costs are down, access is up, and I think most companies these days understand that it's something they can use to more effectively reach their audience, whoever that audience may be. But there are more ways to look at interactivity, and one of them is beyond touch. And this is a whole basket full of capabilities and modalities that are now becoming more accessible to agencies and integrators. Beacon technology, where devices are broadcasting a unique ID and other devices are capturing that ID and using it to pull up information relevant to that particular item. You know, not too many years ago, it was a little bit of sci-fi, and these days people pretty much get the idea. And you could imagine walking around a museum with a tablet, for example, or in a retail environment, you have a price check device that you give shoppers to walk around the store. So there's lots of possible use cases. RFID and NFC readers, it's similar conceptually to the notion of beacons, this idea that devices have unique IDs, and those ideas can be read by some external piece of hardware and information can be pulled up about it. That's interaction. If there's an item on the shelf and on the wall and you're getting information from that item, that's an interaction, right? It's not touch, but there's still a recipient, right, and a sender. The Internet of Things, connected objects, items on the network with an IP address, with an API, and the ability to take information in and share information about itself. When the refrigerator is saying you need more milk, that's an interaction, right? Information is being imparted by the refrigerator to the homeowner. Lots of different ways you can incorporate the Internet of Things. It could even just be something simple like a Nest thermostat or a Philips Hue light bulb, where I'm using some other modality to change the light color, make it turn on, turn it off, or get the temperature off the Nest thermostat, right? This is interaction. Maybe something a little more obvious, speech and motion is interaction. That's not rocket science, right? The ability to speak to Alexa or to Siri. The ability for a device to notice motion and react to that motion by playing a video or beckoning some person over for further interaction using a different modality. These are classic ways of interaction, both passive and active. Historically, seemed difficult, seemed expensive, but that's no longer the case. There's a lot of ways to incorporate speech and motion that doesn't require a PhD. One should consider this as an interactive option. Demographics is a mode of interaction. If I'm using a hardware and software to identify age, gender, group size, I can leverage that to display information specific to that set of statistics about my audience, right? So if it's a 30-year-old female, it could be a different ad than a 50-year-old male. That's an interaction. It's a passive interaction, but in that case, the age, gender, group size information is being imparted to the device, which is then reacting to it. QR codes, that's how you take information away from a screen, right? This is a technology that's been around for a while, trying to gain a foothold. People are still not convinced, is it right? But the reality is we kind of get it. People understand its utility, and it's a very simple way to give something to an audience. You may have a screen behind a window. You can't touch that screen, but based on a QR code, a person can hold up their phone and then walk away from that screen with information. That's an interaction. You have given information to somebody else, and they've taken it with them. And then one final example would be web triggers. If any of you are familiar with IFTTT, if this, then that, perhaps you're familiar with Zapier. Both of these cloud-based options enable one application to talk to another application. There's a communication between applications. So for example, when I get an email, send me a tweet. The infrastructure exists to facilitate this kind of communication, this kind of interaction, and it's become very easy to incorporate this into your own signage work, where you can have if this, then that scenarios where you're cascading cause and effect, resulting in an interaction between applications, between a person and application, and then ultimately between people. So all of these modalities are other options beyond touch that you can use as a way to pitch interactive options for your clients and to anticipate and build skill sets around so you can service your clients as well. But there is a third category of interactivity. We call this beyond the screen, and this is what's going on behind the scenes beyond the screen, where you have data-driven sources passing information between each other. Web services and APIs are, in a way, two sides of the same coin. This notion of information being passed between services, leveraging, maybe it's a REST-based web services protocol, maybe you're using some sort of, C# or JavaScript SDK, some kind of API enabling one application to talk to another and sharing this information directly. That's interaction. And one of the main advantages of interactivity, of course, and we'll get to this, is personalization, right? The way to raise engagement is to personalize. And the best way to personalize is to find out something about the person at that screen and getting information highly relevant to them. You're going to be using web services. You will be leveraging APIs, giving you access to back office ERP applications, or getting information from some data store with shopping history or preferences or whatever. You're going to be doing that, and that depends on some skill sets and ability to work with applications so they can interact with each other. This includes any kind of internet-connected app or internet-connected devices. They're on the internet to facilitate communication. That's the point. You're going to be confronted with these opportunities. You're going to want to build the skills and be in a position to discuss them and pitch them. This is far more, all of this collectively is far more than traditional, non-interactive digital signage. There's so much more you can do to attract and engage beyond traditional signage. You want to develop these skills. Let's talk about why. So I'm appealing to you emotionally. Let's get a little closer to why you should consider adopting interactivity as a skill set in your tool belt as a digital agency or as a systems integrator of some kind. From the client's perspective, it's about engagement and conversion. At the end of the day, if you have traditional non-interactive signage, there's only so much you can do to create engagement and to somehow achieve the level of conversion that is the goal of that signage deployment. Right now, the conversion might mean they know where the exit sign is, right? Maybe it's just giving a simple message. Or it could be a sale, which is highly crucial. But there's a range of possible conversion goals. And when you have traditional non-interactive signage, there's just only so much you can do. You have at least one, if not both arms tied around your back, behind your back. Whereas with interactivity, there's so much more you can do to capture their attention, to engage them, to make it relevant to them, and to convert them in a way that makes sense. I think this is obvious, right? I don't think I'm trying to convince you of something non-intuitive. Clearly, there's enormous opportunity with interactive content to gain a much better return on investment made by your client in the hardware and the design work that you are providing, right? There's so much more return possible through this investment. It's a no-brainer that with interactivity you gain better engagement and conversion. It's also cool, right? I could tell you from our own experience that a lot of agencies are looking at interactivity because they don't want to look old. They want to improve the brand image and make themselves look modern and do things that makes them stand out from the same old, same old. The chart on the right of this graphic comes from a survey conducted by Samsung that literally was about, what is the most exciting technology that you see adopting in the next couple of years, and interactivity topped the list. Because people get it now. When hardware was expensive and all you had was the phone in your pocket, it seemed a goal that was out of reach. But it's not like that anymore. It is accessible, and there's so much that can be done. You saw all the interactive options that exist. There's so much opportunity For achieving that engagement and harnessing that conversion, the interactivity tops the list. It's one of the few technical options that has a direct correlation with return on investment, with engagement and conversion. Everything else in terms of quality and number of pixels and, does it have a direct relationship? Not necessarily. No, looks better, right? But from a business perspective, interactivity is where it's at. It should not be difficult to convince a client that maybe interactivity is in their best interest. Maybe this is obvious for you, but why should you care? Because there's enormous opportunity. The traditional digital signage market is a commoditized one. It's enormous. There will always be opportunity, but there's a lot of competition, right? And particularly from a services perspective, trying to get that margin, competing on price is not a lot of fun. So there's always going to be lots of opportunity out there, but it could be a bit of a challenge to grow a business around that when there's so much competition. There's enormous opportunity as well on the interactive side with a lot less competition because it's particularly small and mid-sized agencies and integrators. They don't feel they have the skill set. They don't feel they have the ability to scale. They just haven't gone there yet. Meanwhile, the large agencies and integrators are all about bespoke development, taking people off the bench, writing code. So their inclination is to take the high-profile, very expensive opportunities, which leaves a whole bunch of small and mid-sized projects ripe for the picking. Let's talk a little bit more about that opportunity. Just so you have an understanding of where you can play, right? So there's the classic passive, non-interactive digital signage market. Cross-cutting that would be the interactive digital signage market, right? There's an overlap, of course. Most of the traditional signage vendors, maybe they do some single-touch interaction. A lot of what they do is bespoke development as well, but there's certainly an overlap. We're not claiming digital signage is a separate market. It's a subset of the overall signage market, right? So there's an overlap. Touch is, relatively speaking, once you do multi-touch, you're kind of outside all of the vendors servicing the traditional signage market. This is a set of opportunity, a portion of the overall opportunity that would be uniquely accessible to agencies with interactive content creation and deployment skills. Where there's overlap is the data-driven and beyond touch categories. Remember, beyond touch was about beacons and RFID, NFC, and motion and things like that, right? Where you're not relying on touch or multi-touch, it's other types of interactions, and that's an overlap with the traditional marketplace. And the same with the data-driven, the behind-the-screen opportunities as well. So that dotted line box, those three categories of interactivity we discussed represents, based on market research, about $500 million worldwide today, growing at a rapid pace. So it's being pulled along by the traditional signage market, and in fact, its growth rate is outpacing the traditional signage market. Why? Because people are realizing this is the next new way to differentiate and not looking like everybody else. Okay? So there's inarguably an enormous opportunity for agencies and integrators. The trick is, how do you structure your organization? How do you think about the market? How do you approach it to compete effectively and get your hands on it? Right? And that's what the rest of this webinar is about. I've convinced you the opportunity is there. I've convinced you there's a lot of ways to access that opportunity. Let's now take a little more inward look at the business, starting with the markets themselves. Right? Because you may choose, you may already have a focus on a particular market, or you might decide ultimately that it's in your interest to focus on a particular market. I don't need to tell you Business 101 is focus on the niche, right? Find an area where a particular set of skills and a particularly unique value proposition and focus on that. So some of you do that. Others are more generic and you're capturing opportunity across markets, but there's really no limit these days. It's hard to imagine a market that would be resistant to interaction when you think about all the interaction options. And, accessibility is a good example. This notion of creating content that is accessible to people with some sort of physical limitation. If interactivity only meant touch, then you would be locked out from a lot of markets that had to make sure their content was accessible. But you're not. There's far many other ways to facilitate interaction, enabling you to, in fact, express accessibility as a value add you can offer, because there are other ways to facilitate that interaction. From maybe it's keyboard driven, so maybe they can't reach the screen but they can reach a keyboard. Maybe it's voice driven where they're speaking to the screen, right? There's other ways to facilitate this. So pretty much all of these markets are open and accessible. It just comes down to where you feel confident and where you feel you can bring some unique value add when you go out to the marketplace and promote your business. Certainly, I can tell you this based on my experience, that not all of your clients have thought about interactivity yet. They get it. They understand the value, but they probably think it's inaccessible because of cost or because it's just too technically advanced for them to consider. So to some extent, it will be your responsibility to raise the opportunity to them, to introduce the option. But this is across markets. There is no marketplace that is closed to you. Indoor, outdoor, sales, information, galleries, libraries, archives, museums, hospitality, entertainment, it doesn't matter. All of them are an opportunity, which is pretty exciting, and it gives you an opportunity yourself to think about, okay, where do we focus, or a particular type of deployment to a particular type of market. You could break it down a little bit further and think about the kind of business you want to run in terms of volume, number of customers and volume, right? Because you could have high volume deployments with possibly very simple content. You could have very complicated content, but more of a one-off, right? So the x-axis here is more that volume deployment where the same thing is in a lot of places. It's a very transactional kind of deployment. It could be a truly traditional signage deployment, but in multiple retail locations. It's interactive, but it's a carbon copy over and over again. That's one way to work, right, is to focus on that. Of course, this brings into considerations like hardware acquisition and deployment and maintenance and support, which we'll talk about later in the webinar. But there is that set of considerations. The y-axis is more about the wow effect, the uniqueness of the deployment. Maybe there's one or two. Maybe it's just for a conference or a trade show. Some short duration thing, a lot of work, a lot of money. You could be anywhere along this spectrum, and it's something you want to think about, because you might discover that you're best equipped at just amazing levels of creative work, generating that wow effect and building a clientele that comes to you for that. Maybe that's what you're good at. You don't want to get stuck in the very simple, more commoditized deployment of content across thousands of screens, right? The bottom left quadrant, low wow, low volume, it doesn't mean stay out of it, but obviously from a business perspective, if it's not very scalable, and not very interesting, you probably don't want to be there, because you're going to get commoditized out by some good enough alternatives on the marketplace, right? So you could do it. It's probably not safe. I'm going to presume that a lot of you on this call are small and mid-sized agencies and integrators. The large ones, they don't need us, right? They got all the skills in-house. They could be all over this thing too, but they're way at the extremes typically. There's so much opportunity in the middle for you guys to grab a share of this marketplace. And again, it helps to think about how are you going to structure your business? What kind of business do you want to generate? Keep this little table in mind. It's going to help you think a little bit about your staffing needs and the kind of clients you want to bring into the business. Let's talk about the staffing needs a little bit. It might be more than you anticipate. I mean, to a certain extent, this might be common knowledge, but you need creative developers. Of course, you need graphic designers. Of course, you do. I mean, as an agency, you have them anyway. But a creative developer can bridge the gap between the IP creation, the images, the videos, the documents, and taking that material and making it accessible across various screens or using a variety of content management systems, that kind of creative technical gap bridging thing, or to adapt content for different types of modalities. to, for example, you have far less video format options on an iPad than you do on Windows. So if you have a format that's not iPad friendly, somebody's got to convert it. These are some skills you may not have in-house you might want to consider. Rich media is taking it to the next level where you're not just limiting yourselves to traditional graphics, but now you're thinking about 3D models and Matterport walkthroughs on the web, or you're leveraging a new it could be web accessible, doesn't have to be technology beyond the traditional, and making it available because, again, your clients are using interactivity, among other things, to differentiate, to look unique and modern. You want to have a set of skills that enables you to adopt these more advanced visual and auditory models. The developers are necessary because you're thinking beyond the screen. Remember that? But not just beacon technology and web triggers, but also web services and APIs and SDKs and connecting apps and back office systems and printers and barcode readers, and all of these things may need some software development skills. You can choose to avoid it. Ultimately, you don't have to do that. You can say, you know what, I'm going to let somebody else do those kinds of projects. I'm going to limit myself to scenarios where that's not necessary, and there's a lot of opportunity there. So that's your choice. But certainly, if you want to be prepared to tackle any kind of interactive project, somebody's going to needs to be able to write code so they can start bridging the gap between the UI you're creating and the back office systems and applications. Okay. There is a process, of course, and it's not entirely different, I imagine, from a traditional signage product, but there are some considerations you need to have that are a little unique to interactive content delivery. The upper set of arrows on this particular slide represents the broader process from conception through ultimately delivery. Now, I don't know where each one of you lives along this spectrum. Some of you only do content creation. Some of you are more focused on deployment. Some of you do all of it. You're probably all over the place, right? But broadly speaking, that upper set of chevrons represents that big picture process you're using to tackle a signage opportunity. The set of chevrons on the bottom represents some things I want to highlight from an interactive context perspective. So let me go to the next slide here. Ideation, depending on the method you choose for creating content, that'll control the amount of time you have at the front of the process, right? The longer it takes you to develop, the longer it takes you to implement and to run pilots and deploy, the less time you have up front for ideation. Obviously, the more time you have, the better. Coming up with the most unique, engaging, and brand-specific content you can, right? So that's the ideation phase. You want to create prototypes. I don't have to tell you that requirements change, right? I don't just mean creep. I mean they totally change, where what your client tells you is completely different from what they want, and you only know that when you've put together a prototype. Particularly for interactivity, don't wait, okay? Because there's far more paths through an interactive experience than a non-interactive one. I mean, if it's not interactive, it's pretty easy to figure out what's going to go on the screen. If it's interactive, there's multiple paths through it. Your client needs to see it early to say, nope, that's not what I meant, or why is this here, or that's exactly it. You get the point. You need to have those prototypes early. Of course, you're setting timelines and deliverables and responsibilities. There's a whole other discussion we could have about the extent to which you're selling a hidden sort of service where you're not exposing your methods, it's all internal, versus kind of bringing in the client as another partner, where they're contributing content, maybe they're even having some control over deployment. That's something you need to work out, because some clients, they don't want to be bothered with anything. Others are going to be attracted to you competitively because you've opened the door and given them the ability to contribute and control some of the timeline and the deliverables. It's a consideration you need to make. It's going to be different from one client to the next. Key process indicators, KPIs. Here's the beauty of interactive content. You know what people are interested in because they interacted with it. right? If it's non-interactive content, how do you really know if it's effective, if it's converting people properly, if it's achieving the desired goal? You don't really know. You can infer as far as that goes, but you don't really know. Whereas with interactive content, you know exactly what's working, right? Because people are interacting with it. There's a whole business opportunity for agencies around collecting, analyzing, and acting on KPIs, which just does not really exist for passive signage. It's a whole business opportunity where you build a skill set to identify what should we measure. Well, what are the goals of the client? What do we need to measure to make sure we're achieving those goals? How do we present that information to the client so they can get the proper feedback from that information? And then what advice can we give them for acting on those insights and modifying either the content on screen or their business itself? Whoop, wrong button. Right? Huge opportunity for you to build a set of skills around this and create a billable option that you can deliver to your clients. So identification of KPIs is where you kick that all off. Of course, iteration, back to the notion of understanding requirements. You want to cycle through it as much as you can. Again, with traditional signage, it's not that complicated to envision what's going on screen and how it's going to work. That's not hard. When it's interactive, there's a lot more possibilities, a lot more things going on. You need to iterate to make sure people are happy before you pilot. Then, of course, you do have the pilot. The same mechanism you'll use to collect the KPIs would be used during your pilot for simple things like nobody ever watches this video. Why is that? Right? Well, how would you know that if you weren't measuring? So pilot is an opportunity to measure, not just to get frequency of use or something like that, but you can learn a lot more from a pilot. Then you're going to iterate and iterate. You're not getting it right. I know each one of you is brilliant and don't make mistakes, but the fact is you're going to want to iterate and make sure the client is happy, getting exactly what they want, learning from the pilot, learning from the collected KPIs, and doing that forever. So when you deploy, those KPIs are being used constantly to reassess the effectiveness of that deployment and what needs to be done to make it more effective and to make sure that it's converting properly and that the business is getting some value out of that investment. Thus, additional services you can consider. We just spent a lot of time on number 4, KPI collection, analysis, and reporting. So this is an additional service you could offer beyond the classic of content delivery. There is back-end development. You could do that. That could be a content management system based on WordPress. It could be anything, or it could be trying to bridge the gap between the user interface and their back-office ERP application. That's a service you can provide. Right? And if you can provide it, it opens up more opportunity for delivering engaging experiences that makes your client happy and want to keep working with you. Of course, as installation and setup, some of you are doing it, some of you are not. Something you might want to consider if you're not, which is not ending your engagement at content delivery, but going a step beyond and making recommendations about hardware and installation of the software and that kind of configuration. And then, of course, after it's deployed, you could also manage, monitor, and support that deployment. You could do that. There's a scale issue there. You need a set of unique capabilities to do it. But it's an opportunity, and I don't know if you've been watching the news. There's a lot of acquisitions lately, and companies are starting to verticalize a little bit again where they're a one-stop shop. Well, if you're going to be competing with any of those guys and they're a one-stop shop, it can get be a little challenging, right? So you might want to consider these additional services as you build out the business. A little bit more about KPIs because it's just such a big deal. Interaction events are the obvious one. What video did people watch? What scene did they visit? What items did they put in their shopping cart? User identification. It's a whole other source of information. It could be obvious. They swiped a badge or they typed an email address, or there could be very explicit proactive ways that you've gotten user information, but it could also be passive, like having a camera identifying age and gender, right? That's identification, but done in a more passive way. This information is crucial because it gives you context to the interaction event. You don't just know what video they watched, but you knew it was a 40-year-old female. That gives not you, your client, far more insight into their audience, which could vary based on the time of day and the weather outside and the floor in the store and the city location, right? All of these variables can impact the effectiveness of a particular deployment. And the more this information you can bring, the more actionable you can make this insight, the more appreciative your clients will be. Which brings us to environmental markers. It's another notion of context, right? As I mentioned, what floor is it on? What's the weather outside? What movie's playing down the street? What's the score of the baseball game? All of these things are not particularly relevant to the exact device per se, but might influence the choices made by the audience. Clearly, there's retail implications here, but it could be a museum, it could be an amusement park, it could be a hotel. I mean, all of these totally different environments have all of these kind of contextual influencers that will affect what choices people make. And if you're going to enable your clients to adopt interactivity, you should give them this opportunity to leverage that to gain much better insight into that audience and how to use it. So let's talk about billing model a little bit. You know, I don't have to tell you how to bill people. You understand how to do that. It's up to you, obviously, depending on the services. You might want to split out, you know, hardware and installation. Do you put software as a line item? Maybe you do. Maybe, you know, is Adobe Photoshop in your quote, right? Probably not. Are you using other software? Depends. Depends on how open your business model is. Remember, you could be very closed, and what you do is a mystery, and your client just hires you to do a good job. Others of you might adopt more of an open model, and here's how we do it, and here's what we use, and we want you to contribute. We do the hard stuff, you do the easy stuff. It's a very healthy relationship, and it could be one you leverage. And so that kind of determines what appears here in the model. What I want to highlight just briefly is the column that says years. It doesn't say units. It says years. So let's talk just a little bit about a subscription model, because for the most part, it's probably not something you've typically done. It's something you might want to consider. To be frank with you, it's not just about interactive content creation. It's just maybe a new healthy way to look at the business, where you're billing on a monthly basis, on an annual basis. You know, you decide what makes sense, but maybe it's not about a deliverable, but it's about your engagement with your client. There are advantages from a client's perspective, from an accounting perspective. As an operational expense, it might be better on the books than a capital expense. It does make things much more predictable for them. You know, if you charge them every time they want to make a change, not only does it become frustrating for them, but it becomes harder to predict, and it's harder to budget. Whereas if it's more about a subscription model of some kind, it's easy for them to understand future costs and scale, which ultimately means higher perceived value and fairness. You know, it's like you know, getting the electricity out of the wall. They're getting value from you. They know what you're going to charge them. You're not nickel and diming them. It just seems fair and makes them a happier client. I mean, there are advantages from their perspective. For you, it's also more predictable, right? I mean, if you're charging on a per project basis, then when the project is over, you're done, right? But how do you get a more predictable cash flow? Well, if you have a subscription business, yes, you're going to have some people jumping on the bus, jumping off the bus. You're going to have a little bit of people coming and going, but overall, it should be a nice line moving up, you know, lower left to upper right, predictable revenue, more clients. You know what's coming in next year as long as you keep them satisfied and provide value to them. There's something to be said for that. Of course, it's easier to scale because it's easier to discuss and pitch. You don't have to have long discussions about costs. It's easier to just talk about, you know, if you want to do another project, here's the additional cost on an annual basis. It's easier to bring in additional business from the same client, and it does build stronger relationships because it's more open and trusting. Again, a lot of you have been kind of billing on a per project basis, and it works, and customers are happy. So I don't want to overdo how wonderful subscription is, but it's something you might want to consider as a healthy and interesting way to adopt interactive project delivery beyond just plain old project delivery, particularly when you're competing with other agencies charging on a per project basis. It could be a very interesting way to think about change, at least maybe not changing the business model entirely, but doing things a little differently. There are many subscription models to choose from. This isn't really the forum to discuss them, but I mean, you can have just a single option. You can have multiple options that involve, you know, the higher the tier, the more it costs, and the higher the tier, the more you do. two, or there's one dimension of it. A lot of ways to play with it, but it's not just one way. Keep it in mind. Last kind of point in terms of implementation is about the platform itself. You have lots of choices, and there's no one right answer. You could be writing raw code. Of course, this assumes you have people who can do that, and this assumes a longer project timeline, just because it takes longer to write code than not, right? So you have the greatest flexibility writing code, because anything is possible, but much longer timelines. You have QA responsibility. You have responsibility for deployment issues. If you're already doing this already, you know what I'm talking about. HTML5 it's development, but it's still a developer job. It's, in terms of complexity, it's not as complex as just writing C++ or something, but there's still a lot of power there, a lot of options. You need the skill set, kind of a long timeline. You still have to do all the dev effort. It can be a little complicated, but a lot of flexibility, a lot of power. Website builders, they're starting to do a little bit around single touch, not a lot around multi-touch. Same thing for HTML5, by the way. It's mainly a single touch platform. You can do multi-touch, but you've got to be really good at it, and it's browser dependent. There's a lot of variables there. But of course, website builders simplify things. Template-driven apps. So you fill out a template. A lot of the traditional signage vendors kind of took this path where pick the template, slot in your content by zone, and it's very easy to adopt and to understand. And certainly there are some platforms out there that do single touch for sure. Multi-touch, not really. You still need custom development, but maybe you kind of bridge the gap where you do some HTML5 coding, but you put it in a template provided by a traditional vendor. Then this is my opportunity to talk about Intuiface, which is it's a what you see is what you get platform, enabling you to adopt any type of an interaction option. You don't write code and you're working with beacons and RFID, NFC, you're working with motion, you're working with speech, you're working with web triggers, you're working with REST APIs, you're working with SDKs. I mean, you name the interactive option, you're building any layout, any design, any workflow, facilitated by any possible interaction modality, and you don't write code. So we exist to kind of create the next generation platform that gives you best of all the worlds. So certainly it's something I'd love for you to consider. But again, there are other options, and depending on the kind of business you want to run and the kind of clients you want to attract and the kind of markets you want to pursue and the deal sizes you want to have, will influence the platform options you choose. So to wrap things up, this is giving an example with Intuiface, but frankly, this is about interaction in general, assuming you make a good platform choice. The idea is if you can find a business model and a staffing choice and a platform selection that lets you create interactive content quickly and efficiently and scalably, it increases the perceived value for your client because you're delivering more, right? You're not just doing single-touch videos. You're delivering something that exceeds your client expectations. You're increasing the perceived value, but because you've also optimized your business around that delivery, your cost is below their expectation but far above your expense. Your margin goes up with the perceived value. Your efficiency, if you do a good job of picking the model and the staffing and the tools, etc., not only are you building it more cheaply, but you're generating higher perceived value. You're exceeding their expectations far beyond traditional signage, which everybody knows it's a commodity. This is not a commodity. This is brand new, and there's an enormous number of options. If you could deliver that efficiently, enormous perceived value, higher margins, and you're very competitive. This is a very exciting place to be, and I hope I've given you a sense of what it takes to compete there. I think you're going to want to. The opportunity is out there. Every company is either thinking about it or open to the discussion because they're seeing it now, right? It's penetrating the marketplace. This is a time for you to jump on board, and I'm really excited for you to try it. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I believe we've been monitoring for some questions that Bradley will triage and I'll hopefully can answer for you. So Bradley, go ahead.
Yes. So the first question we have in today is how big of a threat is digital media, specifically referring to Facebook, Google, to digital out of home? And that's on all three levels you discuss, touch, beyond, beyond screen. Should we be worried or should we embrace and leverage?
How big a threat is digital media to DOOH? Well, what I'd say is this. I still think that you say digital media, I'm seeing social media to some extent. Facebook, even Google, in terms of content delivery, they have Google Plus, of course. But I think it's complementary at this point. It's a data source. It's another data source / another engagement option, right? Certainly Facebook on screen could increase engagement if you do it right. You don't want people logging into their Facebook account and posting things in their wall. That's not secure at all, right? That would be a bad idea. But having a live look at a company's Facebook feed on a digital sign and letting people interact with that sign, and it results in new postings to the wall, I mean, you could create some really interesting scenarios that combine this, what you're calling the digital media, with the out-of-home options that we talked about. So I think it's more of an opportunity than a threat. All of this stuff, it's a very cooperative kind of environment, right? It's not really competitive. It's kind of working together.
Gotcha. Well, still waiting for a few more questions to come in.
Anything you have in mind, guys? You know, I have been asked in the past about, how long is an average project, that kind of scalability question. That's entirely up to you, right? I mean, it kind of depends on the projects you take on board. I can tell you from our perspective, we have customers, it's a one-person agency, where they, there's only so much scale available, and they have to be smart about the projects they take on. Of course, if they make a wise decision about the way they'll produce the content and deliver it, they can get a lot of scale out of a small team. But that's, entirely up to you and how you structure the engagement. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. There's, scale up and down the line.
Right. So we got a few more questions in. The first one is, how critical is the hardware choice to the entire project?
Well, as you can imagine, it's critical in a variety of ways. I mean, first of all, there's cost, right? So there's a trade-off in a way between the hardware expense and what they have left for the services engagement with you, and for the content creation and any other software and hardware that might be in the loop. So clearly that's an issue. The other one is performance. And a good example are touchscreens. There's multiple kinds of touchscreen technology out there, and paired with that is the quality of the image itself, all of which influences price, but also influences perception. If I create an interactive sign with whose hardware leverages technology that has a latency, it's a little slow to react. There's a lag, right? So if I drag an image from left to right, the image sort of trails my finger. Or if I touch something, there's a bit of a delay. Does the audience say, oh, they picked a slower interaction technology, or do they say, this company did a bad job, right? I mean, there's a perception issue there. There's going to be trade-offs, which sometimes is influenced by the size of the screen. If I have a 12-inch screen, maybe I get a nice modern version of the iPad, and you should have good reactivity. But if it's a large screen, you have lots of choices, and you as the agency and the integrator need to balance your client's budget with the perceived level of quality their target audience is going to get. And so there's a lot of thought that needs to be made there about the trade-off between cost and perceived quality. So it's a good question. Right. It's very important.
Right. Our next question is, what kind of hardware do you see in this interactive market? And they gave the example of tablets, walls, or Samsungs.
Certainly it runs the gamut. Samsung was called out. It's an example of an all-in-one. What Samsung has done is they have their own operating system. They call it Tizen. LG is doing this, right? They have a device running an operating system they call WebOS. So you have all of these all-in-one devices with a variety of screen sizes that don't require an external PC. So you put them on the wall, you put them on the table, you plug them in, and they're good to go. They're very popular and they make sense. The general notion is this, though, which I like to call the performance ceiling. Every device performs well up to a certain point. For example, on Windows, depending on how well spec'd my PC is, I could have a multi-screen display wall driven by a single Windows PC, have multiple 3D models on screen, each 3D model is being interacted with independently, and it works fine. You could do that, depending on how well spec'd the Windows PC is. You will never do that on a Samsung SSP. Now, it's not their fault. Its ceiling is lower. It was never meant to handle that larger scenario. So there's really no limit to the hardware options out there, from tablets to multi-screen display walls and all the makes, models, and providers in between. The main consideration you'll have to make is the performance ceiling, and that goes back to the earlier question we had about the trade-off between cost and perceived quality. It's really another way of talking about that performance ceiling. So there's lots of different options, the SSP and the LG WebOS device. Their argument is lower total cost of ownership. You just need that one screen. Everything is on board, Ethernet cable, AC plug, and you're done. But lower performance ceiling than a much more expensive Windows PC and touch display. But the Windows PC and touch display does more stuff. And it's maybe prettier, and there's more engagement. So there's really no limit to the options. You need to keep that performance ceiling in mind.
Excellent. So our next question is, what industries do you see most in demand of interactive solutions? What types of companies have the largest budget?
Well, that's the magic question.
Right.
It would be tough for me to pick a market and say they've got the budget. One thing that could be interesting as an agency, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of your clients aren't thinking about it yet, which also means a lot of your prospects aren't either. And so if you're going to go out to attract their business, you need to think about, well, what business are they in, who's their audience, and how could they leverage interactivity to better engage with that audience? As I mentioned in an earlier slide about addressable markets, every market has an audience. The audience could be internal. It could be employees. Or it could be vacationers in the hotel lobby. It could be an art lover in the museum. It could be a prospect for a sales pitch. So there's totally different markets with totally different set of viewers, but they all have an audience, all of them. So you need to think about which markets have an audience that would most likely convert with good interactive content. What does conversion mean for that marketplace? And will that be good for the client? An example would be museums. Galleries, libraries, archives, museums. They don't have a high budget necessarily, but they are competing for eyeballs. There's lots of alternative options out there. How do we get young and old into our museum, into our gallery, and make them want to stay and come back? Well, this is huge. Technology is huge. And so they're hungry for this. And one nice thing about GLAMS, by the way, galleries, libraries, archives, museums, is it's a rising tide kind of industry. They all want each other to succeed. So if you're successful there, you could benefit from some word of mouth. There's other obvious ones like trade show conferences or hospitality. In the hotel lobby or the restaurant menu, clear audiences. It's pretty easy to understand what conversion means, and you have a really interesting story to tell, which, by the way, combined with KPIs could be very compelling, where you're telling them not only will I help you better engage with your clients and convert them in whatever way that means to you, but you're going to gain insights about them that will help you reconfigure your own business to better attract and retain those people. So there's a lot out there.
Right. Our next question is if you have any business tips for a new two-man small agency for this particular business.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to respond to that. I think one thing that's going to be very important is how you're going to build your business, because if you spend all your time, as you should spend time, what are the right opportunities, what are the right markets, what tools should we use, what technology should we embrace, will all be for naught if you can't bring in the business. So I think that a responsibility you have as a small agency competing with all of these larger agencies is to figure out the most effective way to get your name out there in front of the people whose business you want to attract, right? Now, maybe that means social media like Facebook, Twitter, Google+, and Instagram. Maybe that means you're in a particular business community and you can leverage the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, you need to figure out what it will take to get your name in front of the right people and figure out your pitch, so you can give them a compelling reason to trust this two-man shop when there's a larger agency down the street. I think that, as I mentioned, we have a lot of small agency clients of ours. What they've done is they've created some very compelling demonstrations. They create a very compelling early sales engagement where they're building prototypes on the fly for their clients. They're making a very interactive sales process, very open, and combining that with an aggressive level of effort to get that awareness getting in front of the customer. So you need to think about how to get your name out there, and then think about creating a very compelling early stage sales process to convince people that you know what you're doing and that you'd be a very effective partner.
Excellent. We have a few more in, and one person is saying in their case the interactive hardware cost is a tough sale since the return on investment was less than projected. They have been selling the idea of return on objective. How is this in your experience? How would you say they should address this in your experience?
I like the idea of return on objective. And if you can measure, it's another nice thing about the KPIs is because, again, if somebody says you need this expensive amount of hardware, you need to pay us this amount of money for content delivery, and we don't have no way of measuring if it's going to be effective. Of course they're going to be sensitive to hardware costs. You have no way to measure if it's actually being effective. So first I'd say that if you can give the KPI story, now not everybody might be interested up front, but telling them that you have the ability of measuring the effectiveness so you can fine-tune and fine-tune. Remember, the pilot exists to a great extent to make sure that you're presenting the content properly. It's not about learning about your audience yet. It's learning about what they need and what's effective. So by collecting that information and making sure that every dollar invested is going to get at least $1 of return will make it a very compelling engagement. So you should always, at least from a pitch perspective, even if they don't buy it, tell them you have the ability to monitor and measure to make sure they're squeezing every dollar out. Then there's this great idea of return on objective, which is, well, what does conversion mean? What is the objective? Make sure you have one. Right? It sounds like you do, but for all the agencies on this call, make sure there's a clear objective. If the objective is to have pretty pictures on the wall, that's not very compelling. Figure out some kind of objective, some kind of goal, ideally one that's measurable. That will make it much more compelling and make you a much better partner, because your clients perceive you as a partner and not just as some, interloping means to an end. You're actually there to help their business be successful, not just make a pretty picture. So I think the combination of measuring to ensure they're getting value and identifying an objective, identifying a goal, would be the best way to do it.
Excellent. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, please.
Excellent. So this one is asking, what is your ideal project with Intuiface? Do you have a favorite client success example?
An ideal project. We don't. The reason is this. I mentioned earlier when we looked at addressable markets that some people pick a niche and some go broad. We're broad right now, and so there's no ideal market, that's for sure. In terms of project, I'd say that for an agency, an ideal project. I wouldn't know how to answer that. I mean, there's so many different ones. It's like picking a child, and I don't know that one is better than another. I think that from your perspective, what could be interesting would be a subscription type project, one that will need your assistance over the long term, right? So, I mean, if you were to choose, what would be a better project for you, an expensive one-off or a less expensive but renewable engagement? You probably want the renewable one. But that doesn't mean the high-cost one-off wasn't worth your while, because oftentimes that gives you more exposure. You know, it's something that you can promote. So there's that trade-off there, right? I imagine ultimately a good project for an agency is one you can talk about, right? You can promote your work, and it's something you should always consider in engagement, is getting some clarification about how you can go public with that work and whether you can share it. I can tell you that from our selfish perspective, in the early days of Intuiface, it was very frustrating because we were secret sauce for a lot of our clients. They didn't want their clients to know we were using Intuiface. They didn't want their competitors to know they were using Intuiface. So we didn't have a lot of projects to share. It was a secret, and it was very frustrating for us. We have a lot of agencies now adopting the open model where they're promoting Intuiface as a value add. We use Intuiface. You can use it too. Let's collaborate together. So it's no longer important to hide that fact. They actually promote it, which is good for us. So in terms of the ideal project, forget with Intuiface. There's so many things you can do with Intuiface. I can't give you an ideal project. But I'd say as an agency, an ideal project is one you can talk about with the public. How's that? So that's what you should look for.
Excellent. Well, we're 2 minutes about this at the top of the hour, so we wanted to thank everyone for participating, and we will have this webinar live for download soon on Digital Signage Today. And thank you for joining us, Geoff.
My pleasure. Thank you, Bradley.
Thank you.